I'm John Buchanan. Now what we're going to do within this video is to configure what we refer to as a channel strip for a lead vocal. In other words, what we're going to do is we're going to start mixing this lead vocal for the track that it's working against, but we're only going to use EQ and compression in the main, the core components when it comes to vocal mixing. Before we get into exactly what they do and why we need them, let's have a listen to the completely dry vocal against its backing track.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark I remember. All that we are is becoming a memory. Shadows that dance in the night overcome me. And when I see you, I don't know you. And when I touch you, I can't reach you. And when I see you, I can't face you anymore. No, when I see you, I don't know you. And when I touch you, I can't hold you. And when I see you, I can't face you no more.
Okay, so when it comes to vocal mixing, particularly for a vocal that is as dry as this, in a way, the way that our brains work is that we immediately want to kind of go to spatial effects, reverbs, delays, things that are going to make it feel dreamy in a way that some of the backing track sounds do, that we go to a place where we're just making this vocal more comfortable, because we almost never hear vocals like this. Think about it for a moment. The recording studio is actually quite an unnatural place from an acoustic perspective. If we were to go and hear this vocal being performed in any acoustic space, whether that's a concert hall or a cathedral or a church, immediately this vocal would have the reverberant qualities and the tonal characteristics of the space in which it was being performed being made part of the experience of this. And if we go and see singers performing live to electronic backing tracks or playing with bands, their vocals are being passed through channel strip plugins like the ones we're going to look at, reverbs, delays. The only time we really get to hear bone dry vocals is if we recorded them in the studio and we've configured our studio environment in order to have this bone dry effect. Why do we want it to be so dry? Well, it turns out that reverb is really hard to remove. So if we record vocals in a space where we have a reverberant component, actually getting rid of that out of the vocal to replace it with something else is quite complicated. The other thing about an acoustically treated space is that effectively what it's going to do is it's going to regularize the frequency footprints of the sounds that we're recording as well. In other words, if we've got a nice microphone and a great singer, and we've got a space which is effectively just going to allow those things to be recorded without adding anything else of its own, we've got this really nice framework to then have a vocal we can go on to mix. Now, there's one other massive mistake that I'm making with this project before I even think about how I want to use channel strip plugins to create a mix of this vocal, and that is that at the moment I'm monitoring this entire track through Mastering Assistant. Now then, why is that a mistake? Well, effectively, what we've got is a round of processing which is being calculated for a mix that doesn't exist yet. In other words, by analysing this track and passing it through Mastering Assistant, I'm getting an EQ tone shape that's been auto-configured, and I'm about to significantly change something tonally about this track, which means that effectively whatever I do is going to be slightly fighting whatever this does. I can reapply Mastering Assistant later on when I've actually mixed this track, and we're mixing it right now. So the first thing I'm going to do is to get rid of this. Tempting as it is to run everything through Mastering Assistant because it makes everything a bit more hyped and a bit more exciting, let's do our jobs. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is to think about what actually constitutes a channel strip. So let's analyze that term for a second. A channel strip means a channel of a mixing desk. And if we think about the classic consoles from SSL or Neve or any of the other great companies that have made mixing desks through the years, effectively what we get there is EQ and compression. this opportunity to regulate the tone and the dynamics of our performance. And what we're going to do within this video is to focus pretty exclusively on just those two separate effects. Now then, there is all sorts of discussion about whether or not EQ should come first or whether compression should come first. What do we actually want to do? We're going to change the tone of the vocal with EQ, and we're going to change the dynamics of the vocal with compression. Which way round that should that go? Well, when I was growing up, when I were a lad and all around here were just fields, we're always told that you should EQ first and then dynamically change things afterwards. But interestingly, if you load some of the presets for some of Logic's channel strip solutions for vocals, you'll find that compression comes first. Let's just have a word about that. Rather than actually talking about whether or not compression or EQ should come first, let's just talk about the idea of loading presets to mix your vocals. Please don't do that. Those presets don't know your vocalist, your microphone, the room in which you've recorded, the genre of music you're working on. Just don't do it. Use your ears instead. We're going back to discover that none of this needs to be particularly complicated for it to sound quite a lot better, so don't load those presets. But it is noteworthy, occasionally, that compression comes first, and we'll explore that A-B approach in just a moment. But I am going to start with EQ, which I can introduce simply by double-clicking on the EQ. Now then, before I start making changes, why do I need to make any changes? Tonally, doesn't it sound great already? I've used a nice microphone, my singer's fantastic, so why am I making changes? Well, remember, mixing is all about blending the sound of the thing that you're mixing against everything else that you're mixing it to. So yes, I want the vocal to be the standout thing within this track because it's a really great performance, and of course it's providing us with the lyrics and the purpose of the song. But at the same time, the first question I have to ask myself is, tonally, what do I want this to do that it's not doing already? Is it too harsh in places? Does it need to be airier and brighter and floatier? What? Well, again, let's have a listen before we make any decisions.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark I remember. All that we are is becoming a memory. Shadows that dance in the night overcome me.
Okay, now we're going to focus to start with just on this first section. I'm actually going to turn up the volume in the room a little bit because having lost Mastering Assistant, everything's dropped in the volume a little bit and I just want to be able to hear it a little bit more clearly. Okay, so there are a number of things. Now, I've opened up the channel EQ and the temptation straight away is to use our eyes rather than our ears. But I would definitely say that I do think that we could benefit here from a bit more air and a bit more float, and that a couple of things that are a little bit biting and a little bit growly could potentially be tamed a little bit. So let's have a look at those right now. The first thing I'm going to do is to come and focus on an area in what I would refer to as kind of like the growl zone. So in other words, what I'm going to do is I'm going to boost frequencies around 2 kilohertz. Now then, by doing this by default, I can see that the band that I'm changing is really wide. Which means that as I EQ this sound, loads of frequency content, in fact, really the entire active range of the entire vocal is going to be affected by this change. I don't want that. I want to go and find the areas that are problematic. So I'm going to make the bandwidth of this particular band much smaller. And what I'm doing here isn't cutting, but boosting instead. Now, of course, this is going to make any problem frequencies worse, but that makes them easier to spot. So what I'm going to do first is to press play again, and what I'm going to do is to kind of adjust this frequency area and just see what's lighting up and feeling like it might be a bit overblown and harsh.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark I remember. All that we are is becoming a memory. Shadows that dance in the night overcome me.
Okay, so I've made that so narrow that we're only hearing individual harmonics. Let's just widen it a little bit.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark I remember.
Okay, so here, by boosting by this amount, this is nearly 10 decibels of extra volume, we're hearing this kind of telephony, slightly croaky, raspy thing. Now, how much do we want to deal with this problem? Well, that's up to us. That's the first thing that we're going to change. And having identified this particular frequency area, what I'm going to do is to turn my boost into a cut. How much? Well, again, I can't know until I've tried, but it's not a massive problem. It's just something I want to slightly tame. So maybe, I don't know, a couple of dBs, 2.5 dB, something along those lines might work quite well. It also felt like something else was happening a bit lower down. So what I'm also going to do is to engage this band. And having made my cut, again, what I'm going to do is to narrow this down a little bit so that the two bands aren't interfering with each other, turn this up a little bit more, and then what we're going to do is just to experiment a little bit with what's happening a bit lower down.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark, I remember. All that we are is becoming a memory. Shadows that dance in the night overcome me.
So here we've got this slightly whistly overtone, which I'm not loving, if I'm totally honest. Again, it's not a huge problem, but just something that I'm going to ever so slightly attenuate, maybe even a little bit less than I did with that original change. Now then, I'm deliberately making really small changes because what I also want to do is to make the whole thing feel a little bit airier and floatier. And what I'm going to do for that is to use a high shelf. And effectively what this means is that the volume of upper frequencies continues to grow in volume. So rather than a central, what we refer to as a bell curve like these, where effectively we have a left point and a right point and a curve in between those two fixed points, what shelves do is they progressively add more and more volume above a certain volume. So effectively we eventually end up with this kind of push, if you like. Now again, which frequencies do I want to push? Well, I think we're kind of getting up into the kind of air above sort of 4K, that kind of magic area around here. And again, I'm not going to go absolutely crazy, maybe 3 dB or so of push, and that's going to give us a little bit of a lift. Now, the one thing I did notice when we were listening through to start with was that actually just within the room, there's a little bit of rumble on this vocal. So we've got a few little bass frequencies that are being introduced, which we definitely don't need, way below the active frequency area of my singer's voice. So what I'm also going to do is to use this high pass filter, but I'm going to set this around, I don't know, something like 80 hertz, 100 hertz. And that basically means that any bass that's being picked up through, I don't know, external noises, maybe in the room where I've recorded, little moments where maybe there are plosive sounds going into the mic, they're just being tamed a little bit as well. And that gives us this sound.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark, I remember. All that we are is becoming a memory. Shadows that dance in the night overcome me.
And let's compare that to the original. It's only the EQ that's changed.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark, I remember. All that we are is becoming a memory. Shadows that dance in the night overcome me.
Now remember, I haven't made an EQ cut anywhere that is more than 2.7 dB or a rise. All of these changes, which are actually pretty dramatic when we listen to them in context, are relatively small. And the easiest thing to do when we start EQing sounds is to make massive cuts, massive boosts. Actually, often just a little bit is all that's needed. Okay, let's move on to compression. I'm going to find that in the dynamics folder. And as we know, having made videos about compression before, as you will know, effectively what this allows us to do is to firstly choose the type of compressor that we want to work with. There are a number of different algorithms here. By default, you'll see Logic's Platinum Digital, quite transparent kind of sounding compressor, but we're going to go straight into 1176 land. I never know if I'm supposed to say that out loud. Too late. Okay, so I'm going to come into our Studio FET model, and this effectively is going to give us a pretty aggressive, fast-acting kind of compressor. And this is going to do two things. Firstly, it's going to get dynamics under control. I'll come back to that in just one moment. It's also going to change the tone of the vocal. Now, you might be thinking, well, hang on, isn't that what the EQ was designed to do? Well, yeah, but it turns out that when we change the dynamics of sounds, their kind of tonal footprint shifts as well, as we're about to discover. So, what do I mean by dynamics? Well, effectively what we've got within any sound is a sound that's constantly changing in volume. It's going from silence whenever there is no vocal to maximum whenever the vocal hits its loudest points. And that produces what we refer to as a dynamic range. The dynamic range is vast because it starts at silence and it goes up to whatever is the loudest moment. This little bit of waveform here, I suspect. So effectively, that's our dynamic range, and what compressors allow us to do is to change dynamic range. In other words, what we can do is we can take the loudest moments and we can attenuate or regularize or regulate their volume. So above a certain volume, what we can do is to make sure sounds don't get as loud as they used to, and that changes the dynamic range. And then what we can do is to take the new dynamic range, and if we want to, we can turn the whole thing back up in volume, making the quieter moments louder than they were before without the loud moments being too loud. We've made lots of videos about compression, so if this is a topic that you don't understand or want to spend more time on, absolutely go and watch those. What we're going to do here is we're going to set up some compression settings which hopefully are going to allow us to get dynamics under control. And the first thing I'm going to do is to turn off automatic gain compensation. So when it comes to the volume output from my compressor, it's not being automatically boosted by Logic. I want to be in control of how much extra volume I add. Okay, so the way that compressors work is like this. The dynamic range, the bits I want to compress, have to exceed a threshold. In other words, the volume can be as quiet as it likes, but when it gets to a certain volume, the compression is going to start working to pull down the volume of signal portions that are louder than that threshold. The threshold is the point at which compression is introduced. How hard do I want my compressor to work to pull down the volume of those louder moments? Well, that's set by the ratio amount. And what I'm going to do is start with a ratio of around 4:1. In other words, volume is going to have to work 4 times as hard to get louder above the threshold point. And what I'm also going to do is to turn off automatic release of the compressor. This is effectively the attack and release dials set how quickly compression is applied and how quickly the signal recovers when it stops being applied. I'm going to set a relatively quick attack, and I'm going to set a sort of generous release time so it sounds natural and it's not snapping closed. Now, as I've said, we've made lots of videos about compression, so if all of that felt a bit quick and a little bit like, what? Go and watch those. Okay, let's set some dynamic settings for this vocal.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark, I remember. All that we are is becoming a memory. Shadows that dance in the night overcome me. And you're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark, I remember.
Okay, so I've started immediately just A-Bing the before and after without telling you that that's what I'm doing. That's not fair, is it? What I'm going to do this time is to do precisely that. I'm going to take out both of my 2 channel strip plugins, the EQ and the compression, and the second time round we're going to listen carefully to what happens when we introduce them. So this is the dry vocal.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark, I remember. All that we are is becoming a memory. Shadows that dance in the night overcome me. And you're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark, I remember. All that we are is becoming a memory. Shadows that dance in the night overcome me.
Okay, so there's more float, there's more air, there is less harshness, and all of that is being achieved with pretty small changes from an EQ perspective. Now, I talked a little while ago about the idea of should compression come first or should EQ come first? Well, it's pretty easy to find out which one of those two things we like better. What I can do is to take the EQ down below the compressor, and what we can do is to hear whether or not we prefer the sound of that. So effectively now, that is happening rather than what was happening before. Compression first and then EQ. Sounds like this.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark I remember. All that we are is becoming a memory. Shadows that dance in the night overcome me.
Okay, and let's really make that point. What I'm going to do is to copy the EQ back up here. So this is the original. So this is EQ first, followed by the compression. I don't know why the compressor's suddenly done a strange thing. Let's open that back up again. So effectively, this is EQ followed by the compressor, and then the second time round, I'll take out the first EQ, punch in the second, and we'll hear them the second way round.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark I remember. All that we are is becoming a memory. Shadows that dance in the night overcome me. And you're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark I remember. All that we are is becoming a memory. Shadows that dance in the night overcome me.
Now, it's a pretty subtle change, but it is there. And what I mentioned before was that, of course, what happens when we start compressing signals is that effectively, because we are dynamically restricting sounds, it's tempting to think of that only as being a volume change. But of course, sounds are made up of their frequency content. So as we adjust compression, what we're going to discover is that the tonal footprint of a sound is affected by those dynamic changes. And in fact, hip-hop producers in particular, usually when you ask them which processor they can't live without, they'll tell you compression, because they can tune their compressors to provide them with the kind of overdriven kind of bass subby push and the kind of crispness of the hi-hats that they want. In other words, it's a tonal character as well as a dynamic character that they are dialing in and playing with when they begin to manipulate compression. And to my ears, even though our settings are a little bit, well, much less extreme than that, effectively what we're getting is a little bit of extra sibilance when the EQ comes second, because the compression character is just slightly pushing the top end, and it seems a little bit thinner to me this way round, but that might just be me. So you might be thinking, okay, well, it still doesn't really sound like a mixed vocal. Well, no, it's true, because what we're doing here exclusively is focusing on EQ and compression as the kind of footprint, the starting point for blending our vocals. And when it comes to mixing vocals, these are probably the two most important processes. However, it is true that two things haven't happened. We haven't looked at the slightly harsher back end of this song, where we might need a different compression and EQ solution. We'll come to that in a moment. And what we also haven't done is to begin to kind of blend any sort of spatial character within this mix. Well, let's do that second one first. What I'm going to do, just to satisfy ourselves, is to do two things. Firstly, what I'm going to do is to dial in some reverb. I'm going to just place this vocal in a space. I'm going to do this really quickly because it's not really what this video is about. I'm going to come down to Space Designer, and what I'm going to do is to find a kind of medium-sized plate reverb, or maybe a large plate reverb. which is going to be kind of nice for vocals. Let's, in fact, look, vocal plate, what could possibly go wrong? So straight away, this is just going to give us a little bit of space, which I think we're going to probably find quite reassuring.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark, I remember.
So now we've just immediately got the kind of comfort of the fact that there is a space around this vocalist, and immediately that makes us feel better because, as I said before, we usually hear vocals in spaces. Okay, so how might I look at the back end of the song where everything becomes more problematic? What am I going to do if it turns out that the kind of floaty solution that I've gone for from an EQ perspective doesn't work at the back end? Well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to take my vocal, I'm going to duplicate the track, I'm going to chop the vocal at this point, and I'm going to set up a new track which is using my EQ and my compression to start with, the solutions that I've set up already as a starting point, but with the potential for me to now go and find the problems in this vocal as it begins to get a little bit harsher. And vocal producers will do this all the time, split out the different sections of their songs onto different tracks so that they can EQ and compress them. So what we've done within this video is we've looked at EQ and compression on vocals as a kind of first step on the way to mixing a vocal part. It's not the spectacular EQ as delays and reverbs that we might be waiting to add to this to kind of make our vocal mixes sound absolutely fantastic. But these are the building blocks of making a great sounding vocal fit within a track. So EQ and compression, which order you use them is up to you, but now we have a bit of an understanding of how they can take the kind of raw, dry vocal quality that we get from a good studio recording and begin to make those parts feel like they really belong within our tracks.